What's up, guys? Ben here, bringing you another video today. We're continuing our preseason, I guess, beginning of regular season preview series for the upcoming CDL season. And today we're going to talk about, I think, two of the three biggest franchises and sort of fan bases in the CDL in Call of Duty, and that is Atlanta FaZe and sort of FaZe Clan and OpTic Texas and OpTic Gaming. I think these are two teams that both made some real interesting moves in the offseason. I think they both had good, not by their standards, because their standards are really high, great seasons. And I want to give you my kind of unbiased thoughts on both. I know I really want to say this off the offset of this video. I always get called like a FaZe fanboy or whatever, that I enable MC / Shellium on sneaking, and I don't know, all the terrible takes I've seen on Twitter and Reddit the last like week or so. I want to make this video as subjective as possible. I think both teams definitely had things to work on from last season. And I do think there are some questions about these moves for both teams that I am going to highlight in this video. So let's start off and talk about Atlanta FaZe. All right, so after FaZe lost in the grand finals of Call of Duty League Championship, I hate the championships playoffs split in Call of Duty League, but whatever. They lost COD champs in the Vanguard season. They decided to move on from Arcties after all those second places they got and no wins that year, and they brought in Slasher. So they went down, you know, sort of the same path they'd been doing for a while of just kind of bringing in new Maniard to play with the Abizi, Celium, and Simp trio. And you know what? They actually had like a pretty good start to the season at Raleigh. They came up really just short against Seattle in Toronto, sort of at the end, in New York, sorry, it's New York, Toronto, and Seattle, kind of the end of that Raleigh tournament. But there was a lot of promise going into Boston, and they actually followed through and played amazing at Boston. They, you know, looked incredible in S&D, and we'll get to that sort of in the middle of this video. And they were able to beat LA Thieves in the final of Major 2 and win that. And at that point, people were like, okay, well, you know, once again, these guys are going to be a factor, you know. But from there, they weren't able to get another another sort of championship, and they were close at pretty much all these events at Dallas. That was probably one of the Dallas Columbus stretch. I don't really think that that was sort of their best Call of Duty that they were playing at those events. Came up short against OpTic in front of that crowd. Didn't look like they were going to be good value to beat Toronto, and I think a lot of the shortcomings were on Hardpoint and on Control, the respawn game modes. At Columbus, again, sort of same thing, but this with Thieves and with OpTic. And to be honest, I think they actually probably should have gotten fourth at Columbus if Abizi didn't do crazy things against New York. Major 5, they looked really good at the outset of this Major 5 tournament in Toronto. I believe by the end of it, they didn't lose a single Hardpoint, but weirdly enough, in the final series, they didn't win a single search against New York, which was very, very surprising. I think this was a very winnable tournament for them that they kind of let slip through their fingers. They pulled up the champs, and they played pretty good at the tournament. But as you can see here, the only lost to two teams to this tournament: the team that won, the team that was the runner-up, losing to Toronto in winners final. Again, I think Claude is off of not winning the swing game mode. And thought maybe you heard this before, the same kind of thing happened against New York. So really, at the end of it, as good as FaZe was, as consistent, again, if we go back here and look, as consistent as they were just ended up being the second or third best team for most of the year. Once again, ruined kind of missed chances to probably win 2 events or more that Modern Warfare 2 year. So the big change they have made in the offseason is they have actually let Slasher go. And I actually think that Austin played pretty good for them. You know, as much as we've talked about, I think them being the second, third best team, like Austin came in and did a really good job, I think. And we'll take a look at the stats, really rounding out their search and destroy game. I think in general, keeping these guys as a very professional team that really just didn't, you know, when they were playing their C-level COD, they were still the third or fourth best team in the league. I think every other squad in the game has had lower lows than they did. And Austin kind of helped, I think, do a good job from a leadership standpoint of sort of like normalizing where they needed to be. I think the issue, and I know that Crowder has talked about this on our Scrap Time show a couple of times. The thing that became apparent at the end of the season, and we'll take a look at the stats to support it, was that there was a little bit of a role issue with the 2 ARs as far as the way that they wanted to play in Respawn and play in Control, which I guess is also a Respawn game mode, so I don't know what I'm talking about, Hardpoint and Control. And so it made sense for them if they wanted to, you know, support Cell, who, you know, I think Slasher's obviously an all-time great player, but they're going to pick one to keep, it's going to be Cell. Kind of support him being a little bit more of a slower AR, be someone that plays a little bit more in Hardpoint, what you want to see from, you know, people like accuracy, kind of getting that max hill time. They want to bring in someone who's going to be a little bit more of a traditional flex player. So with LA Thieves breaking down, they go ahead and they pick up Drazah, and I think that move makes a lot of sense for them. So let's take a look at what they needed to work on from last season, and then I'll give you my kind of final thoughts on Drazah and take a look at the schedule coming up. All right, so a couple of things stand out right away from taking a look at their map win and loss stats from last season. First off, 70% win rate, 70% win rate in search. Oh my God, I can't pronounce. With their only bad map being Fortress S&D, and they were just amazing in every other map. I mean, these guys were by far and away the best search team last year. You take a look at the final win-loss percentages for teams in the CDL. New York actually made a really good run at the end here to kind of get into the top 4. But you see, there's basically FaZe and then everybody else after that. Like, they were just incredible at this game mode all year. And I mean, I could point to a lot of specific stats to you. Like, these guys just did not toss 4v3 rounds. They won 80% of rounds in which they got a first blood, and they got a first blood at 54%. Being number 1 in both those stats. I mean, we could just keep scrolling here. It was even better on offense. They won 82%. The only other team that was just as good was Toronto. I mean, again, on your free time, if you want to take a look, these guys were just the best search team last year and had one of the best S&D seasons of, I think, all time. Outside of some maybe the Cold War year for FaZe, the Dynasty years. And I think picking up draws, they're probably still going to be really good at this game mode. So I don't see them getting any worse at S&D. In fact, they may keep these numbers up or be slightly worse, but even slightly worse. If you're winning 3 out of 4 searches you play, like, I think you're going to have a great chance of winning every series you play. But where these guys, uncharacteristically, I think for them struggled last year was in the respawns. They just, as good as they were grinding out some of these series, they were never really for an entire year like an elite team in either one of these game modes. They always had like 1 or 2 weak maps and having to play around sort of a smaller map set. And I think really the one map that kind of killed them at the end of the year really was Hotel in both hardpoint and control. They were just a 500 team on that map. That map ended up in a lot of series against teams like New York and Toronto and OpTic. And at times, yes, they win that map, but because you're 500, there were times they were not winning. They were not able to close out game 4s. They were really struggling to win game 1s and control swing modes on that map. They would lose a bunch and then they would end up, you know, depending on how the vetoes go, to a plus map for the other team that they would then lose map 4. So I think their inability to be really good on hotel control kind of limited their ceiling, because they were actually pretty solid at a CeeLo. And it flips on the hardpoint as well, because they were by far and away, I mean, the best or one of the best embassy hardpoint teams by the middle and the end of the year. You know, Fortress, they had their ups and downs, but by the end they were really good at that map. Hydro, inexplicably, they were bad at that map, which whatever. Mercado as well, but the Hotel then ended up in a lot of series and they just didn't win them at an elite rate. But I want to like demonstrate, like, when they did click, like in hardpoint and control, like they were obviously unbeatable. Stage 1, they came up just short. You see stats really good across all the game modes, but I mean, man, like, you know, stage 2, you see that somehow they won Boston by not winning a single hotel hardpoint the entire split. But you see that these map records, these win-loss records, can be deceiving, because when they did take hotel out, they were combined 6-2 on Embassy and Mercado online and on land, only losing 2 series in Boston, and then a pretty good win rate as well on control. 6-4 is solid. You see just not a big sample size. S&D, they were automatic, but you start to see, like, again, because they're so mid at respawn, it kind of swings. And we'll take a look at the game win-loss records. It's kind of demonstrated this point even further. Like, you see that hardpoint and control for sort of the middle of the season, they were just sort of a 40% team. And yes, yeah, you can go on an old stage and lose 1 S&D like they did when they pulled up to Dallas/Arlington, but that wasn't enough for them to make it to the grand final there. And then, you know, a little bit worse and still the same kind of result at Columbus Major. And then we look at the final 2 events, and they finally figured out hardpoint at stage 5. What's really kind of misleading, I think, about this 6-5 is this is taken to factor that they lost 4 S&Ds on Sunday at this event. So outside of that, their S&D record would be like squeaky clean. But you see, they were going to respawn, and that did put them in the final. And then at Champs, and we talked about this, man, really big struggles in control, specifically on a CeeLo at this event. They were actually 1-1 on a hotel, good at hardpoint, but not being able to win controls, not being able to win the swing modes. You lose 3 hardpoints. You know, if we take a look at sort of their game 4 percentage, this was sort of a big issue. If they are a team that is ending up with not their plus map due to the AB selection, they were only winning game 4 at a less than 500 percentage, and same for game 3. They were automatic in the searches, you know, we talked about that in game 1s. But this is a big problem. We talk about how much control is a swing mode, and I don't have the exact stats on when they lost control, how often they would lose Game 4, but I got to expect that it's pretty big. So what does that mean for Drazah coming in? Well, I think Drazah is an incredible control player. So I think mechanically, and I think strategically, they should get better at control. Now, the control maps in this game with sort of invasion, Karachi, and high rise are a little funky. So we'll see off the rip kind of if a team really pulls away in the game mode, because I think offense is particularly difficult on these maps right now. But I think with Drazah coming in, I kind of expect if we, the hard point, the S&D to be really elite. So I really like that move for FaZe. Again, just to repeat what I said earlier, I think that Flasher played really, really good last year, and now it's just more just a product of them wanting to change the system. They also had a great season. With Drazah coming in, I think they naturally put everybody in their best roles. And I think in particular, the player that I think will have a better year than last year is going to be Simp, because I think now there's less of an onus on Simp to play around the hill, kind of soaking hill time, and having to deal with lack of red dots. I think in a little bit more structured, although I think the spawns are kind of messed up in this game, a little bit more of a structured game with red dots, maybe a little bit slower. I think he's going to really exceed at being just nuisance player that can kind of take routes, getting behind people, while his teammate Abizi is just an absolute force going forward. Draws an absolute force going forward, and obviously you know what MC does. So I really like the move for FaZe, but my biggest questions for them are, will they improve the respawn records from last season, and can they keep up the record in search, because 70% is hard. So let's take a look at who they have going up against in the stage 1 qualifiers, and then I'll give you kind of my short-term and long-term thoughts. So first match up against Boston, first match on Friday. This one I actually think is a little bit more of a toss-up because it's the first match, and FaZe have actually, if you think about it, have not really won their first game if you count Kickoff Classic, and since Modern Warfare 2019 they lost their Kickoff Classic match in Cold War. They lost their Kickoff Classic match in Vanguard. They lost their first match against Boston last year. So they're not batting particularly good in recent years. On this, that being said, and we'll kind of get to Boston in sort of a later video this week, I don't know if this Boston team is as ahead as they were last year. And so I do think FaZe may grind this out. But there's good value there if you are into betting as far as taking either sort of the game line of it going to 5 or taking the money line on Boston. Then they got a matchup against Thieves, who I also think are a pretty solid team just to be the last match on Sunday. So I think two difficult-ish games for FaZe that I probably think they'll split 1-1. And then they have Seattle as their last match in December, which I think will be a really interesting one because I think Seattle's kind of in a good spot right now. But then they get to the easy part of their schedule. LAG, Vegas, Carolina, I think are all W's for them when they get back in January. And then they close out against OpTic Texas Sunday night before Boston. So I expect FaZe probably to end up with probably 4 to 5 wins on this. They're going to make winners bracket. I just don't see, with the difficulty in the schedule and it being early, they'll have some stumbles. So I just think them having a 1 or 2 seed is probably trickier because I think some other teams have easier schedules. But listen, short term, from everybody I've talked to, they're saying that this is probably the best or the second best team in the game right now based on scrims. So, they're going to be a factor in Major 1. They're going to be a factor at Champs. The thing with this team that they have proven over the years as they've been together is that this team, like any other team, has peaks and valleys, but their valleys, when they're playing their worst COD, they're still the 3rd or 4th best team in the league. And I think that's still going to happen this year with how top end it is. If they can figure out this Drazah move, and you see early that Simp is a massive factor. BG plays the level he played last year. Like, this could be another Cold War year for FaZe as far as their ability to just kind of be super far ahead of everybody and use their skill. But if that's not the case, or they have the inability they've had the last couple of seasons to close in finals, I think them and Toronto and OpTic and New York are really going to be duking it out in a lot of these Sundays at events. And I could see FaZe winning 1 or 2, but maybe not dominating. So I think FaZe have made the right moves here. Curious to see what they do this season, because I think they've got at least 1 chip. But can they go back to the grand finals at Champs and win the Champs final for the first time since Cold War? And by the way, last year was the first year they actually did make it the grand finals at Champs, which is crazy. Abizi and Simp have been in every COD Champs grand final since Black Ops 4, and last year was the first year they didn't make it to it. That's wild. So let's see if they can end that streak and get back to their ways of finishing at least first or second at COD Champs every year. All right, there's a team I've actually been looking forward to talking about for a while, OpTic Texas. I want to, before we even talk about sort of their season at the end of Vanguard, Modern Warfare 2 this year, I want to take a full step back and talk about the franchise. Talk about, I think, real lack of success for this franchise relative to the other large fan bases in Call of Duty, as well as upstart teams like Toronto and New York that since the last time OpTic was in a champs final, which was IW, all these other teams have had successes. And I think there's a lot of reasons as to why this is. Obviously, the Dynasty team kind of fell apart in World War II, and they had to kind of deal with the ramifications of that. They had a really kind of long stretch of a couple of years after that where they'd have good starts to the season and then really kind of peter out at the end of the year and be a non-factor at champs. They obviously had to deal last year, and we'll get to it, with Scump retiring, so now they're in kind of a new era of leadership on the team. I'm really, if I are sort of management OpTic, if I'm Hector, if I'm the coaches, you know, Karma and JP, look, like, I think for OpTic, the beginning of the season, middle of the season, it's always a grind. But I think what the fan base should expect this year is for this team to actually be a contender at champs, because the last couple of years, this team has pulled up to champs and they've generally been out by Friday or Saturday morning. And I think seeing that now for 3 or 4 years straight, I'm not counting Empire, by the way. That is, you know, they weren't OpTic at that point. That was Team Envy, bro. Since IW, this team needs to get a good champs run together, good end of season run together. And I think this team might be able to do it, but they might have some struggles early on in the year. So let's dive in. So Vanguard year. Vanguard year. I mean, they obviously dealt with the Illy hand injury after winning Major 1, and it was just kind of a tough run after that, and they were just sort of pretty much a non-factor. As good as they played online, they got to LAN, and they were just whatever for most of the year. So they had an interesting decision in the Modern Warfare 2 offseason. They had Hydra on their team in the group text, and then they decided at the 11th hour, you know what, let's run it back with our team that we started the season with last year, now that Illy is back, and let's try and win again. And I think in retrospect, will be looked at as probably one of the worst roster decisions in the history of Call of Duty. And maybe I'm being too harsh, I don't know. But obviously Hydra went on to win champs this year, win 3 events, and win MVP. So he could have been on their team. And the other side is they stuck together, and they were terrible at Major 1. I mean, they didn't get out. they didn't make it deep at that tournament, losing to Florida twice. And I think that's kind of unacceptable for an OpTic team at the start of the season, as good as they've been. And it had some major ramifications to their squad. They tried to pick up Pred. That didn't really work out for a number of reasons. They tried to drop Bruce and send him to Seattle, and that didn't work out. You know, Scump was on the team, and then he retired, and then they needed to fill a spot. Hook was someone they tried to potentially get on LAG. That didn't work out. He got released, and they picked him up. They tried to get out RCs. It was just a mess, bro. It was a mess. And so they ended up, by the sort of end of Major 2, the team they had was Shotzi, Illy, Hook, and Dashi. And I think they actually weren't too terrible at Major 2, getting 4th at that event. And I thought, like, you know, it looked pretty decent, like, at the end of Saturday. I thought that they actually had a legit chance at the bottom side of the losers bracket to get deep. But then they ran into the Toronto, went into the LA Thieves Buzzsaw, and really were a non-factor against them. And after that event, they decided to make one more change. They decided to drop Illy, and they picked up Dan Ghosty from the team that won Challengers at Major 2. So again, going back to that summer roster change, you decide to keep Illy and Dashi after dropping them, and then you end up like dropping both and then picking Dashi back up like 6 months later. So, and you know what, actually, the move to pick up Dan in this version of 4 was actually pretty solid for most of the middle of this year. And online, they were dominant. And at LAN, they made it to back-to-back finals. They made a really good losers bracket run at their home event, just coming up short against Toronto on a Hydro Hardpoint. And then at a Hotel S&D, I think will haunt them because they really threw that map away, an opportunity to be at match point going into map 6 of that series. And then LA Thieves are just a better team than them at Major 4. Just plain and simple, Thieves are just kind of on another level. Finally, had solved their S&D issues, the Steal Control issues, and they were just a better squad over OpTic at that event. And they still look good online at Major 5 going into that event. We're one of the favorites. We've learned now is that there were some behind the scenes, you know, issues going on in the OpTic camp. No surprise there, to be honest, over the history of some of these rosters. And they laid an absolute egg in Major 5. Went 0-6, didn't win a single map. Probably one of the biggest disappointment performances of any team, RE expectations last year. And then they pulled up the champs, and they were out pretty early in that tournament. So after a real promising middle of the year, after kind of figuring out their roster, it was over. It was over just like that. Going this offseason, they had some big decisions to make because, did you want to kind of keep Dan after that good start that they had with him this year? They decided to move on because it seems like there were some behind-the-scenes issues with Dan. I like Hook, but it was clear that he was going to have to have played out of his mind and win a chip for them to keep them going into the upcoming season in which Pred was going to be a free agent. So they end up making two moves. And they pick up Pred, obviously, finally from Seattle, aka free agency. And then they get Kenny in free agency from LA Thieves because that team kind of broke apart. And we'll talk about that in probably the next couple of videos, preview videos. So the roster going into the season is Dash and Shots, is the only two holdovers from last season with Kenny and Pred joining them. And also, by the way, it seems that Damon is now their full-time coach. So I think that's kind of important. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. So listen, the biggest thing that's going to stand out when you look at this OpTic win-loss record, other than the fact that they were like pretty good as far as their series count, is once again for the second year in a row, they were for most of the year not a particularly good control team. Going back to Vanguard, they had a great start in that game mode. And then once Illy got hurt, they really kind of petered off. And they kind of continued that struggles into most of last season. They kind of got a little bit better control at the end of the year, but they still end up with sub 500 record. Their surge was good, but not great. They'd improved through the end of the year, but they were not sort of an elite level S&D team, which I think maybe would have helped them, especially at the end of the season when their respawn hardpoint wasn't as strong as teams caught up. And I mean, their hardpoint was great. They basically set sort of the hardpoint meta at the end of the season as far as really being aggressive kind of in 2 out of 3 lanes on the map and really funneling teams through one lane and having and making things very easy in a game with no red dots, with, kind of the limited sort of things we had in that game. Like when you were able to funnel teams, it was free cash when you were holding hard points. And this team was insane at it on a Mercado. They were insane at it on a Hotel. They were insane on it on Fortress. They were good at Hydro, but I think Toronto and New York kind of at times were better than them on that map. And I don't think their life couldn't figure out Embassy hardpoint last year. It didn't matter what team they had. That map was an enigma to them, so they just didn't play it. And you kind of see stage 1 online okay, but when they got to land, stinky. And part of that was, again, control struggles and not an elite team in search, which the Florida Mutineers were when they lost them twice at that event. Stage 2, this is sort of the funky kind of transitional team situation. So I think the map records I'm going to kind of ignore here because they played like 2 different teams during the split and they were still trying to figure out the squad they wanted. But they were pretty good at search actually in this split, so we'll give them that. Stage 3 is when they started to play with Dan and their kind of final team. And you see, again, this is where they kind of went on that hard point streak. They were actually kind of iffy when the team first formed. Like they had good series and bad series online, and they really kind of found themselves in the losers bracket actually of the Major 3 tournament. And that's when they went on this hard point run. But again, you see the S&D, I think, was probably the reason they really, one of the reasons why they couldn't get over Toronto in that grand final, especially on Hotel. But they got to their best form at Major 4, and they just kind of ran into an LA Thieves team that just sort of played better at that tournament. You see these map records, pristine, lost 3 hard points the entire split. S&D and Control both above 500, lost 2 series, the whole split both to Thieves. Like that was just the issue. They were just the second best team. Sometimes it happens. And then stage 5, and this factors in the 0-6 map count across these game modes, because outside of that, they were looking flawless coming in this tournament. And then I don't know, it seemed like it must have happened like super quick of them just kind of breaking apart. But you kind of see then at Champs, they do win that first series, but then they kind of have a stinker from there. And you see the map records, they revert to being kind of mid-packet search. They really, people had kind of figured out their Mercado game. They lost a Fortress. And I think really tellingly actually about their sort of map pool situation is they got away with not really playing a CeeLo with Dangosi. They tried it out at stage 3 and they weren't great at it. And they only played it one time after that. And I actually think that, kind of really limited their sort of avenue to play certain teams on maps, because I just was not a fan of Fortress S&D, and I thought it was like too straight up. Mercado S&D was basically a bang out. And so like maps like a CeeLo, where if you're a team like OpTic that's got good mid-round reads or should have good mid-round reads, people like Dan and Shotzi on your team, like I feel like they should have put a little bit more work into mastering that map, and it would have given them some good kind of decisions for teams like Toronto and FaZe that were good at the CeeLo to kind of make as far as facing them. So that's kind of really how it breaks down. I mean, I think the other kind of interesting split to look at is sort of this one. I think this, to me, this is always kind of, I don't really like honestly kind of looking at this split, because there's a lot of nuance that gets lost on the online to LAN kind of difference. But I think it kind of speaks towards some weaknesses in their game. In particular, we keep mentioning, I think the control they were able to paper over sometimes online with sort of sound EQ. But when they got to LAN, some of the plays that they would make, especially in Fortress Control, you know, the famous one with Shotzzy pinching their spawn on defense, like they got punished on LAN for making those plays. So something to think about. And I think, you know, if you think about the moves they've now made with Fred coming in, with Kenny coming in, I think a lot of it is to sort of address one, kind of the lack of, I think, culture on the team that needs to be set. I think it's the biggest thing with the Ken move. It is a little bit about roles, because Ken is going to come in and not have to run necessarily a sub. He's going to be your flex player in the way that the meta is playing right now. Like, he's going to have an AR in his hand, unless it becomes a very sub heavy game, which I don't see right now. But I think the biggest thing that Ken's going to do is he's going to be no nonsense. This is a franchise that I'm tired of hearing the last 3 or 4 years complain about, like, not having the best vibes behind the scene, not having the best practice. That's just unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable in this era because they're rivals. LA Thieves, really disciplined professional team that comes top down from their coaches. Atlanta FaZe, and I think the coaches have helped set that culture, but they have a trio that's now stuck together for 5 years. Like, they have a minimum expectation of what they want on a day-to-day to practice. They've worked through a lot of initial issues, and, like, you know, they're gonna be buttoned up. Toronto, very professional as far as practice goes. New York, you've seen that whiteboard. They're buttoned up. And so to me, that's the elite competition that OpTic has to match. And they've been too much of a vibes team for the history of the CDL. I think Ken's going to come in. Yes, Ken knows how to handle a team, how to really fit in with easygoing or real, like, you know, Ken's kind of played with your Austins, who are very buttoned up. He's also played with more of the looser players. Ken's going to come in and set the right kind of culture and really hold this team accountable to the lack of success and any kind of valleys that they have throughout the season. I like the Pred move, but in this one might be a little bit of a fire take, I think. We'll see how you guys feel in the comments. I think the Pred and Shotzzy combo could be one of the best sub combos of all time. But on the face of it, and what I've seen online when they've teamed in eights in some scrims that I've watched, when teams have played against them, is I do think that there is some chemistry that needs to be figured out between those two players, because the issue is that neither player has ever been the type of sub player that is balls to the wall, front line. I'm pushing, you know, pushing positivity. I was gonna say pushing people. You got my point. Like really like that sort of aggressive, a BZ or Kleenex type sub player, scum type sub player that, you know, is just not always hitting routes. They're really going to be like getting your entries, getting your, you know, trades and your three pieces, and really opening things up for other players to make plays on other lanes around the main lane when they do that. Shotzzy's never been that player. He's one that's always taken routes, found gaps. And Pred's play style is very similar, but slightly different. He's a little bit more of like kind of what you see from Hydra at times. Like, he'll play corners and get that easy one, and then really play off the information and really help out his team. I just think that what that's issue with both players is they set their team up to play 2v4, 3v4 sometimes. And I think you could get away with that in Modern Warfare 2 with some of the way that Harpoon played in that game, with the spawns, with the lack of red dots. I think in this game that is very rotation heavy, that is very hold your crosses with ARs, if your sub players are not making the other team ARs panic and readdress effectively on rotation at the beginning of hills, and you're just trying to pinch, I think they're going to run into a lot of problems if Bruce or Ken is having a bad map. I just think that one between Pred and Shotzzy is going to need to evolve into some version of that kind of player, what you see from Kleenex, what you see from a BZ. So I think they can figure it out. But my caution to the OpTic fans is that I would expect some inconsistency from this team early on until they learn that lesson, or they figure out how to make his play style work in a consistent way. But it's not to say I don't think they're going to be good, because I actually think this team will still be good. And let's take a look at their upcoming schedule in stage one and kind of wrap my thoughts about the team. All right, so their first match is going to be the last match on Friday, the first day, against New York Subliners. Banger. I think for both teams, they want to start off with a win. This momentum would be huge. And I think that flank episode will be really interesting after that match, because whatever team loses, I think some people are going to have some interesting takes depending on how that match goes. I actually think OpTic have a really hard schedule to begin the year. Rocker, I think, is a trap game Sunday night. I do think that Rocker are probably going to be pretty prepared for that match. I think the Rocker team definitely is less skilled than the OpTic team, and on paper, this OpTic team should win that match. But if they don't win versus New York and they go into this one being a must-win, like, it can get a little dicey. And then they play Seattle, and that one's going to be definitely a grudge match because you've got Inder playing his former team, you got Rambo coaching and playing against his former team, you have Hook playing against his former team. You've got Alec, who may have in an alternate universe ended up in OpTic Texas last year. So I just think there's a lot of trap potential early on for OpTic here, and then they close out against Clayster and Carolina Ravens, who I expect OpTic to take care of business against. So OpTic could have potentially a pretty dicey start to the season, and they get a couple of weeks to figure it out. And then I actually kind of like the next two matches. Vegas and Miami should be dubs. Unquestionably, I think OpTic should beat both these teams. Then they go up against Atlanta FaZe, and theoretically they should have winners bracket locked in by that point. But if they kind of struggle through the front end of the schedule, they go into this like 3-3, and depending on tiebreakers, they might need to win this one against Atlanta FaZe to make it the winners. So just I think in general for OpTic, I think they just got a really tough draw to start the season. Here, yes, there's a world where I think they take care of business, they show their skill, and they start off 3-0. We're having a different conversation, but there are landmines here that they need to be careful about. And I think what we've seen from OpTic Texas early on this season, because they missed some time at the beginning of the season with Pred having to sort his visa issues, is they were a little behind the last couple of weeks. Have they made up that gap since then, since we last kind of saw them play on stream? I saw a scrim against them versus Atlanta FaZe recently, and I thought they played pretty good in it. So I think OpTic is definitely starting to catch up, but I wouldn't be surprised if this team is sort of similar to what we saw with Dengosi being last year, which was stage 3, where they're going to be on, they're going to be off, and it's going to be a little inconsistent until they sort of figure out some of the role stuff. But I think once you get to the middle and the end of the season, I think more so than any other OpTic team before it, I think this team is well positioned to progress really well throughout the year. And I would expect this is finally the roster that coming into champs is a real factor, and they're fighting on Sunday to make it to the winners final, losers final, grand final. And they finally get the OpTic fans something to cheer about for their own team instead of watching OpTic go home on Friday night, Saturday morning like they have the last couple of years. So I like the moves from OpTic. Here's to see how it works out. And I'm actually really excited for this OpTic FaZe. OpTic, I mean, honestly, bro, outside of Toronto, OpTic plays the other two of the other top four teams in the league during the split. So I'm really excited to see what they do off the rip here this season. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I think to summarize for Atlanta FaZe, really like the Drazah move. It puts everybody in sort of natural role positions. They do have a tricky schedule in stage 1, so don't expect them. I think, they were kind of the 3-2 Kings last year in qualifiers. I expect them to probably be a mid-pack seed for that first event, but they're a team that seeding doesn't really matter. They're going to play everybody tight. I think OpTic have a tough schedule as well. And I think unlike Atlanta FaZe, because of the number of changes that OpTic has made and with Ken coming in, I just think there's going to take a little bit more time for OpTic to be the best version of themselves. I just don't think that going into this major 1 cycle that I'm going to put them as my top favorite, but they've got the skill to do it. And the minute that they figure it out, they're going to be a very dangerous squad in the CDL. And I think that they are going to be one of your contenders. And I think one of the teams I think that's going to make it to the grand finals at champs this year in Call of Duty. Yeah, those are my thoughts on these two teams. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought of this preview video. We got more coming out this week before matches start on Friday, so make sure you tune to that. And as always, guys, we will see you on the next video.